Have you ever wondered why in old photographs from the 19th century, purportedly depicting the construction of grand cathedrals, capitals, and palaces, we see not so much the process of building from scratch, as strange scaffolding enveloping already completed, yet somehow dilapidated buildings? We were taught that the 19th century was an era of industrial boom and architectural flourishing. But what if I told you that it was an era of the greatest vandalism in history? An era when ancient heritage, bequeathed to us by a previous, far more advanced civilization, was massively disfigured, clad in cheap brick, and reworked to appear primitively medieval, to conceal the truth about our past. You have been deceived. Everything you see around you in the historic centers of our cities is not the result of the genius of 19th century architects. It is the result of a grandiose falsification, which was given the harmless name of restoration. Look closely at the official chronology. We are told that in the mid-19th century, almost simultaneously across the globe, from Vienna to Washington, from Paris to Melbourne, a building frenzy began. In cities lacking heavy machinery, developed logistics, or a sufficient number of skilled laborers, suddenly, like mushrooms after rain, gigantic structures in antique, Gothic, and neoclassical styles sprang up. Historians claim that these were built by bearded men in bast shoes and robes, armed only with a chisel, a wooden mallet, and horsepower. But let's set aside emotions and engage cold logic and mathematics. To construct just one such building, for example, the Vienna Opera or the Parliament building in Budapest, millions of tons of processed stone are required. Not just cobblestones, but perfectly polished blocks fitted to a fraction of an inch. Official history is silent about where the quarries were located, capable of producing such a volume in a matter of years. It is silent about how these millions of tons were transported to the centers of densely populated cities over dirt roads that turned into impassable mire after the first rain. Imagine the logistics. Convoys of tens of thousands of carts, blocking traffic for decades. Yet in old photographs we see empty, clean streets. Where are the mountains of construction debris? Where are the barracks for an army of workers? Where are the material warehouses? They are absent. Instead, there are finished buildings that are simply being cleaned, painted, or reworked. My theory, based on the analysis of thousands of archival photographs and blueprints, is that the 19th century was a time of appropriation. The new authorities, who occupied the empty cities after some global catastrophe, faced a problem. They lived amidst grandeur that they could neither replicate nor even properly repair. These buildings were too perfect. Their architecture screamed of technologies inaccessible to people who had only just invented the steam engine. Leaving everything as it was not an option. It would raise unnecessary questions among the populace. Who built these gigantic arches? Why were doors 16.5 feet high needed? Why did windows extend deep underground? And so, a project of global alteration was launched. What we today call historical styles, neo-Gothic, neo-Renaissance, neo-Baroque, are essentially camouflage. The task of the architects of that time was not to build, but to conceal, to chip off perfect molding that did not conform to new religious or political dogmas, to brick up superfluous windows, to reduce door openings so that they would fit the height of an ordinary person, not a giant. The most terrible crime was committed against the facades. Originally, many of these buildings were made of white stone or artificial high-quality geopolymer concrete. But the new masters of life began to massively clad them in primitive red brick and cover them with plaster. Look at war-torn buildings in Europe. Very often, beneath a layer of fallen plaster and 19th century brickwork, a completely different structure becomes visible. powerful, perfectly even blocks, polygonal masonry, which is impossible to create with hand tools. Brick is a parasite on the body of ancient architecture. It is the material of a civilization that lost the technologies of stone casting and was forced to construct its dwellings from baked clay. We are told, this is how they built. It's rough masonry, with a facade on top. But why would one make the rough masonry worse and more primitive than what lies beneath it? Why, in the foundations of so-called 19th century buildings, do we find blocks weighing tens of tons, while above them there is crooked brick? The answer is obvious. The foundation and skeleton of the building stood here for hundreds, or perhaps thousands of years, before the first official architect arrived at the construction site with a blueprint in hand. Another glaring fact is the absence of project documentation. Yes, we are shown beautiful watercolor drawings of facades, which are called projects, but any structural engineer will tell you that it's impossible to build a structure from a pretty picture. Thousands of pages of calculations are needed: material resistance, hydraulics, communication schematics. Where are they? Why have working drawings, estimates, and construction logs not been preserved for most of the great building projects of the 19th century? We are told they burned in archives. What a remarkable coincidence. Archives burn precisely where the truth about the origin of buildings needs to be concealed. Or perhaps these blueprints never existed at all? Perhaps these watercolors were drawn from life, from already completed objects, simply adding new decorative elements to them to pass off wishful thinking as reality. We are approaching the most interesting point, the so-called ancient ruinization. In the 18th and 19th centuries, artists such as Piranesi or Hubert Robert massively depicted ruins. Official science calls this a whim, a fashion for ruins, the artist's imagination. We are told that aristocrats deliberately built ruins in their parks to indulge in melancholy. Consider the absurdity of this statement. Would you build a burned-down shed in your backyard to feel sad? No. These artists worked as the photographers of their time. They documented reality. They drew what they saw: gigantic ruined complexes, overgrown with trees, covered with soil and clay. And it was precisely these complexes that were later restored, or more accurately, rebuilt to suit the needs of a new civilization. Doesn't it strike you as strange that many museums, theaters, and train stations look like temples? Why do stock exchange or bank buildings feature ancient colonnades? Functionally, they are not needed there. They block light. They are expensive to maintain. But if we assume that these buildings originally had a completely different purpose, perhaps technical or energetic, then everything falls into place. The new owners simply moved into empty structures, hung up a bank sign, and started doing business, while simultaneously chipping off symbols they didn't understand from the facades and replacing them with the coats of arms of their kings. This was an appropriation, a hostile takeover on a planetary scale. And to prevent us from realizing that we live on ruins, a fairy tale of gradual architectural development was invented. But if you start comparing construction dates, population numbers, and technology levels, this fairy tale will crumble into dust. Let's set aside romance and pick up a calculator, because mathematics is the sworn enemy of official history. We are told fairy tales about how, in the 19th century, in just a couple of decades, entire districts of Paris, London, Moscow, and New York were built. Historians claim it was an era of rapid growth, but let's look at the demographic reports of that time. The population of large cities then was only a small fraction of what it is today, with more than half of the residents being paupers, children, the elderly, and service personnel. The actual number of able-bodied men who could work on construction sites was critically low. Now compare this with the volume of construction.
We are talking not about thousands, but billions of bricks.
To produce such a quantity of fired bricks, not just clay quarries are needed, but gigantic industrial factories operating around the clock. But where are they? On 19th century maps, we see isolated brick manufactories whose output physically could not cover even 1% of the actual construction. But even if we assume a miracle and imagine that bricks materialized out of thin air, there arises the problem of fuel. Firing clay requires colossal temperatures and, consequently, mountains of coal or wood. If the official version were true, all the forests of Europe and America would have been clear-cut by the middle of the century, and cities would have been covered by an eternal smog from the kilns. However, in old panoramas we see a clear horizon and untouched forests. This is a technical contradiction that cannot be explained by traditional methods. Let's move on. Logistics. This is the Achilles heel of any historical falsification. In the 19th century, the primary mode of transport was the horse. One horse can carry a limited load and requires daily care, food, and water. If millions of tons of building materials were truly being transported into cities for the construction of these gigantic complexes, the streets would have turned into impassable rivers of manure and mud. A transportation collapse would have paralyzed the life of any metropolis. Logistics calculations show, to build, for example, the historic center of St. Petersburg or Vienna, using the methods and within the timelines that textbooks lie to us about, would have required a number of horse-drawn vehicles exceeding the population of these cities threefold. This is absurd. It is a physical impossibility. And now look at the so-called cultural layer. This is perhaps the most audacious lie that archaeologists feed us.
We are told that over a couple of hundred years, the ground level has risen several feet due to dust, dirt, and human activity. Are you serious? Look at your house. Has it sunk significantly into the ground over the past 50 years? No. But for some reason, 19th century buildings are massively submerged into the ground up to the first or even the second floor. We are told these are basements. But why would you create full-fledged windows, doors, and arches in a basement that lead to a blind wall of earth? Why decorate underground floors with intricate stucco that no one will see? The answer is simple and terrifying. These are not basements. These are former ground floors. The buildings were not built underground. They were buried. And this is where we get to the core of the vandalism disguised as restoration. Those who arrived in these cities in the 19th century did not build these houses. They excavated them. That is why in old photos we see earthen trenches along facades, which historians present as the laying of utilities. They weren't laying pipes. They were freeing entrances. But it was impossible to excavate everything. Too much soil, too few resources. So the decision was made to permanently bury the lower floors, turning them into basements, and to move the entrances to the second floor level, attaching primitive porches and staircases that architecturally do not at all align with the majestic facades. Look at the disproportion. Huge doors, designed for 10-foot giants, and small, pathetic handles, nailed somewhere at the very bottom so an ordinary person could reach them. Gigantic stairwells where one has to take mincing steps because the treads are too wide and high for us. This is alien architecture. We are in it like children wearing their father's jacket. And for this jacket to fit at all, the new owners began to alter it. They inserted floor slabs, cutting tall halls into 2 or 3 floors to increase usable space and save on heating. After all, heating halls with 20-foot ceilings, without atmospheric electricity or other forgotten technologies, with ordinary firewood, is impossible. The vandalism consisted of primitivization, ancient ventilation and heating systems, whose operating principles we still don't fully understand, were ruthlessly broken and replaced with smoking potbelly stoves. Unique light wells were bricked up. Arched openings were walled in, leaving small rectangular windows. This was not the construction of the century. This was a global renovation, designed to adapt the dwellings of a highly developed civilization to the needs of survivors who could barely read. They concealed the traces of a catastrophe, plastering over cracks and passing off ruins as new constructions. But what exactly caused this catastrophe? Where did the tons of clay and soil come from, burying the ground floors worldwide? Why did official science invent the term cultural layer to explain the unexplainable? If you think that buried floors are a localized problem of a few old cities, you are deeply mistaken. This is a planetary phenomenon, and it is the key to understanding what happened in the mid-19th century. Geologists and alternative researchers, conducting chemical analysis of the soil that covers the ground floors of buildings from Omsk to Montreal, are coming to a shocking conclusion. This soil is identical. It is not humus, not garbage, and not traces of human activity, as official science claims. It is homogeneous clay or loam, without humus impurities. This is only possible in one case: if a torrent of mud, water, and soil fell on cities from the sky, or if soil liquefaction occurred as a result of a powerful seismic or energetic impact. We are living on the graveyard of a previous civilization, and our homes stand knee-deep in the mud of this catastrophe. Now let's look at the earliest photographs from the 19th century. These are the so-called daguerreotypes from the 1840s and 1850s. What do we see in them? Majestic avenues of Paris, Rome, St. Petersburg, Berlin. Grand architecture, spires, columns, domes. But these images contain one chilling detail that makes your blood run cold. There are no people on the streets. None at all. The cities are absolutely dead. Official historians try to justify this with the imperfection of the technology. Supposedly, the exposure time was too long, and moving people simply blurred and disappeared. This is a lie designed for the ignorant. Even with a long exposure, a crowd would have left ghostly traces, blurred smudges. But the streets are pristinely empty. There are no carriages, no horses, no merchants. Only solitary figures who look like accidental survivors in a post-apocalyptic world. These photographs are documentary evidence that the cities stood empty. The population was either annihilated or evacuated, and those who came later, in the mid-19th century, arrived to find everything ready-made. We are a civilization of squatters who have moved into someone else's palaces. This is precisely what explains the vandalism we call renovation. The new inhabitants did not understand the purpose of many structures. Take, for example, the so-called star forts. There are thousands of them across the planet, and their geometry is astonishing. The official version states that these were bastions for defense against artillery, but any military engineer will tell you that such a complex shape, with many rays, creates numerous blind spots and is inconvenient for defense. Moreover, many of these stars are located in lowlands, which makes them meaningless as fortifications. However, if you look at these stars from above, they strikingly resemble diagrams of giant circuit boards, resonant circuits, or magnetrons. In the 19th century, a massive campaign was launched to destroy these objects. They were torn down, buried under earth, and rebuilt into parks and prisons. Why? Because these were elements of a global energy system of the past. These objects could generate or receive energy, the nature of which is unknown to us. The new authorities who seized the world were in a panic that people might accidentally activate these mechanisms. Knowledge was lost or confiscated, and the devices themselves were destroyed under the guise of land improvement. What couldn't be destroyed was altered beyond recognition, changing its function from technological to religious or administrative. Pay attention to the metal ties in the masonry of ancient cathedrals and buildings. We are told these are structural reinforcements. But metal in stone expands with temperature changes and tears the masonry. Ancient builders could not have made such a childish mistake. This means these metal frameworks had another function. Perhaps they were conductors. The entire city was a giant microchip, where cathedrals with their domes covered in gold leaf and topped with strange antennas, which we now call crosses, functioned as receivers of atmospheric electricity. In the 19th century, this system was disconnected. Antennas were replaced with religious symbols, wiring was torn out, and stations were converted into places of worship. We walk on the ruins of a power plant and pray to generators, thinking it has always been this way. The 19th century catastrophe didn't just bury cities in clay, it erased memory. A so-called reboot occurred. New populations began to be brought into the emptied cities. Where did they come from? This is one of the most terrifying questions. There is a theory that the population was restored artificially, using cloning or incubation technologies, traces of which we find in strange institutions of that time called foundling hospitals. But about this, there is complete silence in textbooks. We have been made to believe that we are descendants of apes who slowly evolved, even though all facts scream that we are degraded descendants of gods, or an artificially bred race settled in a ruined Eden. Look at the statues of that time. Marble veils, exquisite craftsmanship, the imitation of fabric in stone. 19th century sculptors could not replicate this, even with the best tools. They merely copied, creating crude imitations. The technology of stone casting, the technology of softening granite, all of it was instantly forgotten. Why? Because there was a generational break. Those who possessed the knowledge disappeared. Only those remained who were handed a pickaxe and shovel and ordered to excavate entrances. History is not a science of the past. It is a tool for managing the future. And in the 19th century, this tool was honed to perfection. We have examined the physical evidence of substitution, impossible architecture, buried floors, the absence of manufacturing capabilities. But physical vandalism was only half the battle. The main operation was carried out in human minds. To prevent the new inhabitants of the captured cities from asking unnecessary questions about who built these palaces and why they were so cold, the chronicle of events had to be completely rewritten. An illusion of linear progress had to be created, where we are the pinnacle of evolution, and our ancestors were dirty savages who worshipped the wheel. For this, the most massive information purge in history was carried out, which I call paper terror. Remember how often libraries burned in the 19th century? We are told, candlelight, wooden floors, carelessness. But for some reason, it's always the repositories of unique manuscripts and ancient maps that burn. These are not accidents. This is the deliberate destruction of evidence. The few books that supposedly reached us from deep antiquity are in fact rewritten copies created precisely during this period. Monk scribes? Forget it. These were entire bureaucratic departments of the new administration that fabricated chronicles, inserting desired dynasties and events and destroying the originals. Look at maps before 1771. In the first edition of the British Encyclopedia, which had not yet been censored, a huge part of Eurasia and North America is labeled as Great Tartary. This was a gigantic state entity with its own flags, coats of arms, and capitals. Where is it in history textbooks? It's not there. It was erased. On 19th century maps, This area is already blank or fragmented. Where did an empire larger than Russia and Britain combined disappear to?
It was destroyed not only physically during those catastrophic events, but also mentally by erasing any mention of it. We were given the Mongol-Tatar yoke to explain the presence of Eastern artifacts and genetics, turning everything upside down. A great civilization was transformed into a horde of nomads on small horses. And now for the most important trick, the chronology. Have you ever felt that historical eras are suspiciously similar to each other? That the scenarios of wars and revolutions repeat themselves? This is because our history has been artificially lengthened. The official chronological scale was approved precisely during this period of world reshaping. To hide the fact that Antiquity, with its incredible technologies, was literally just yesterday, 1,000 years of an invented Middle Ages were inserted between us and it. Dark Ages, dirt, plague, Inquisition. This buffer was created specifically to break the connection between eras. We were made to believe that Roman aqueducts and Greek temples are things of a distant past that don't concern us. But if we remove this artificial gap, it turns out that the so-called ancient gods and heroes are precisely those builders whose homes we inhabited after the catastrophe. In the 19th century, a machine of mass education was launched. The Prussian school model, now used worldwide, was created not for enlightenment, but for standardizing thought. Children were torn from family traditions and loaded with a single, top-down, approved version of reality. They were forbidden to think. They were ordered to memorize. It was then that the concept that people in the past were dumber was introduced. This is an ideal psychological defense. If we believe that our ancestors were primitive, we will not search for lost technologies in their heritage. We will look at pyramids and think they are tombs, not technical devices. We will look at cathedrals and see places of worship, not acoustic resonators. Language reform is another act of vandalism. In the 19th century, alphabets changed worldwide, grammar was simplified, and the imagery of letters disappeared. This was done so that new generations would physically be unable to read old texts, even if they had survived. We were cut off from the informational field of the past, just as the internet is cut off in a rebellious region. We speak a newspeak that is incapable of conveying complex concepts of the world's order. The change of calendar completed this process. We were switched to a new chronology, thoroughly confusing the dates. None of us can now say with certainty what year it actually is. 1812? Or perhaps the 500-and-something year from the creation of the world in the Star Temple? Or the 201st after the catastrophe? We are lost in time. We are a civilization with amnesia, who woke up in intensive care and believed the story read to them by the doctor at their bedside. But this doctor is an imposter. He wears our father's robe, but in his pockets are the property deeds to our home. The official history of the 19th century is a hastily stitched patchwork quilt designed to cover the corpse of a great era. The seams of this quilt are bursting in all directions. Demographics don't add up. Logistics don't work. Technologies are missing. But we continue to believe this lie because the truth is too terrifying. The truth means that we are not developing, but degrading. That we are living on the remnants of past splendor, consuming resources that we did not create. And most importantly, the truth means that the catastrophe could repeat itself, because we still haven't understood what caused it last time.